In the summer of 1878, when the prairie heat lay heavy as a curse upon Harper County, Kansas, the earth itself seemed to hold its breath, as if it knew what was about to come and feared it, and perhaps it had reason to fear, for what unfolded in those months was not merely an outbreak of disease, not merely the scourge of typhoid fever tearing through a small and pious farming community, but something stranger and older and more dangerous, something that to speak of even now feels like scraping a nail across the thin ice that separates the sane world from whatever lies beneath. Because when the fever came, it came with a swiftness and cruelty that stunned even those who had seen sickness before. And yet, in the midst of this wave of death, there stood 4 men untouched by it, the Blackwood brothers, whose very survival should have been a blessing, but was instead the opening of a door that no one sane would willingly approach. For they did not remain merely human for long, and the change in them was such that even the physicians who first witnessed it refused to put pen to paper. And the Kansas State Medical Board, in its infinite fear, sealed the records with a finality usually reserved for the darkest scandals. And the Methodist Church in Cedar Ridge, which had recorded every baptism, every marriage, every funeral since its founding, burned their own mentions of the family, as if ink and parchment themselves could carry the contagion of whatever the brothers had become. The signs began subtly, though in hindsight there was nothing subtle about them at all. It was just that the human mind flinches from what it cannot accept. And the first whispers were of shadows that no longer obeyed their owners, of silhouettes cast in torchlight that seemed too long or too short or not quite connected to the body that made them. And then of voices that acquired a strange resonance, as though 4 throats spoke in chords instead of notes, a sound that made listeners wince and sometimes clutch their ears. And then the eyes, dear God, the eyes, which at first only caught the lamplight strangely, and then began to reflect it back in a way no human eyes should, bright and sharp like the eyes of animals that hunt in darkness. And it was said that if you looked into them too long, you would see not yourself reflected, but some vast depth of sky with no stars at all. And always there was the question, if they were immune, if they had been spared, why had they been spared, and at what cost? The final words recorded in the last surviving medical report, before the state locked it away forever, were spoken not to the public, not to a congregation, but whispered between men in an office thick with cigar smoke and fear. Subjects have transcended human biological classification. That was the phrase. An acknowledgment that whatever the brothers were by the end of that summer, they were not men as we understand men. And it is that phrase, and the silence around it, that has endured for nearly a century and a half. For science will not touch. It will not even acknowledge it happened, though the land remembers, and the locals, those who still live in Cedar Ridge, will turn their faces away when the name Blackwood is spoken. And some will tell you that names themselves have weight, that they can call things back if used too freely. If you are reading this and expecting the comfort of reason or the order of medical explanation, then stop now, because you will find none of that here. This is the kind of knowledge that once taken in cannot be spat out again. It sits in the bones, it stains the marrow, and you will find yourself thinking about it in the hours when the world is quiet and the mind has nowhere to hide. And you will begin to suspect that faith and science are not opposites at all, but 2 sides of the same ancient coin, a coin that spins only when it is tossed by something greater and more terrible than either, and when it lands, it does not land, heads or tails, but on its edge, balancing between salvation and damnation. The conflict between faith and science in this story is not the neat, polite kind you read in books or hear in debates, where one man quotes scripture and another recites data. No, it is the raw and dangerous collision of 2 forces trying to make sense of the same impossible thing, and the thing refusing to be explained. For the Blackwood brothers themselves claimed they were undergoing divine transformation. the hand of God shaping them for purposes beyond human comprehension. While Dr. Samuel Morrison, the only trained physician in the county, measured their temperatures, felt their pulses, saw the patterns forming in their skin, and knew that whatever was happening was breaking the rules of biology so completely that even to describe it would make him sound mad. And so he kept his notes locked away and spoke only in careful, measured phrases. But in his private journal he wrote the truth, that he feared he was looking not at men touched by God, but at men remade by something else entirely. Yet it is too simple to say the doctor was right and the brothers were wrong, or the other way around, because the changes in them were both miraculous and monstrous. And perhaps the oldest truth is that those two things are not opposites, but kin, born from the same fire, one lighting the path to heaven and the other to hell. And who can say which is which when you are standing in the flames? And so you begin to see why the question of faith and science in this tale is not a question at all, but a trap, for to believe one is to deny the other, and to deny either is to close your eyes to half the evidence, and so the only honest way forward is to walk blindfolded into the dark and pray that you will feel the ground under your feet before you fall. Cedar Ridge in 1878 was a place that lived by faith because faith was cheaper than proof, and proof was hard to come by on the open prairie, where the winters could freeze a man between his barn and his door, and the summers could strip a crop to dust in a week. And so when the fever came, the first instinct was to see it as a test from God, and when the brothers survived, to see them as chosen. And that is why the townspeople at first came to their farm not in fear, but in reverence. And that is why the Methodist minister himself went out to see them, and why, after he came back, he would not speak of what he saw, only burned their names from the church ledger, and told the congregation they must never again speak of the Blackwoods. And so, you see, faith did not fall away in the face of what happened. It bent itself to fit, and science, too, bent itself, sealing its records and refusing to publish. And so in this place, for this story, faith and science did not oppose each other. They made a silent pact to look away. But there were moments when the two collided, and when they did, the air itself seemed to shiver, such as the night Dr. Morrison first examined Ezra Blackwood and saw the golden luminescence moving through his veins, saw it pulse with a rhythm, too slow and too deliberate to be blood, and Ezra, sitting perfectly calm, despite a temperature that would have killed any other man, said, "You are measuring with tools meant for the old world, doctor, and you are asking the wrong questions." And Morrison, for all his training, felt something cold settle in his stomach, because he knew Ezra was right, though he could not admit it, not even to himself. And there is another moment, though it is spoken of only in the Fletcher's family line, the moment when Josiah Fever, already burning through him, laid his hands on little Timothy Fletcher and prayed that the boy's suffering be taken into himself. And the boy's fever broke, and his eyes cleared, and he asked for bread. And in that moment, Mrs. Fletcher believed in miracles with all her heart. But Dr. Morrison, standing in the corner, watching Josiah's skin begin to flush with unnatural heat, felt the bottom drop out of the world, because he understood that a transfer had occurred, but not the kind you can measure, not the kind you can put in a ledger or a chart. And it is in these moments, these collisions, that you can see the theme most clearly, for faith insists that what is seen is the work of God, and science insists that what is seen must have a cause in the physical world, and here was something that satisfied both and neither at once. The dangerous part of such knowledge is not that it proves one side wrong, but that it forces you to admit that both sides are looking at the same shape in the dark and calling it by different names. And if that shape is moving, changing, becoming, then what you call it matters less than the fact that it is coming toward you. And perhaps that is why the story of the Blackwood brothers was buried, not because it would shake faith, not because it would undermine science, but because it would make both admit that there are things that stand outside their walls, looking, in, waiting, and when those things choose to step inside, there will be no defense. That is the true weight of the first theme, the collision of faith and science, for it is not a collision that destroys one or the other. It is a collision that fuses them into something else entirely, something with the certainty of faith and the precision of science. And that is too much power for any human hands to hold. And perhaps that is why, even now, the earth in Harper County will not give up the last traces of that summer, and why. The wind across the wheat still sounds, to those who listen closely, like a voice speaking in chords, a voice you cannot quite hear with your ears, but which once heard, you will never forget, because it will be in you, as the Blackwood brothers, or in the land, as the fever was in the town, as the thing behind both was in them. Before we go further, I must tell you something that I have never spoken aloud in full, for fear that the words themselves may not simply inform, but invite. And once they have been heard, they cannot be unheard, and once they are known, they cannot be unknown, for the thing we are about to discuss is not the sort of mystery that passes harmlessly through the mind, but the kind that clings to the edges of thought, staining every conclusion and corroding every certainty until the safe shape of the world bends and then breaks. If you are listening now, I will assume that you are either careless with your own peace or too stubborn to turn back, for the story does not only concern events long buried in Kansas soil, it concerns a type of knowledge that has a way of surviving past the grave of the teller and burrowing into the listener. And I will not lie, there are things in what follows that I do not fully understand, but have felt as a pressure in the back of the skull, as if something alive is pressing from the other side. You will remember that the official histories have nothing to say about the Blackwood brothers beyond their names in old land records. You will also remember that the state medical board sealed the case files and that the Methodist archives burned their references entirely, but there are sources they did not destroy, scraps kept by those who could not bring themselves to let the memory die, and from these fragments a fuller picture emerges, and in that picture there are details far worse than the familiar accounts and more dangerous because they are harder to dismiss. The deeper truth is this: the brothers did not merely survive the typhoid outbreak. They did not simply endure its fever and weakness without harm. Their bodies altered in ways that no modern infection has ever been known to cause, alterations that seem to have advanced with each passing day until there was more in them that was alien than human. If we are to take the surviving testimony at face value, the first changes were small. The loss of proper shadows, for example, not the fading of a shadow in dim light, but the total absence of it at noon, when the sun was high and clear, and the town physician at the time described this absence in language that seemed almost frightened. He wrote that they cast no darkness on the ground, only a faint distortion in the air, like heat over a road. Then there was the matter of their voices, at first deeper in tone, then somehow carrying an overtone that caused discomfort in those nearby. There are reports of nosebleeds and headaches in anyone who listened for more than a few minutes. One farmhand claimed he heard a sound beneath, the word something low and continuous, like a hum through the bones of the skull. The hand quit his work and left the county the next day. As the weeks passed, the transformations grew more pronounced, their skin taking on a translucence that revealed a faint golden shimmer beneath, not merely a reflection of light, but a glow, as if the body contained its own slow-burning fire. When Dr. Morrison lanced a wound on Ezra Blackwood's forearm, he wrote in his private notes that the blood was thick and luminous, the color of molten metal cooling in air. The sight of it so disturbed him that he asked permission to collect the vial for analysis, which Ezra refused with a calmness Morrison later described as unnatural. These details alone would be enough to suggest an unknown disease or chemical poisoning, but the records contain stranger claims from townsfolk who witnessed the brothers together in the field at night, not working, not speaking, simply standing. In a loose circle, eyes open and unblinking toward the horizon, and in the stillness the cattle would not graze, the dogs would not bark, and the air would seem heavy as if it resisted movement. One witness swore that the wheat around them bent toward their bodies, though there was no wind, and that when the moonlight struck their faces, the pupils of their eyes narrowed to vertical slits. It is here that the story becomes more dangerous, for there are those who believe the brothers were no longer merely men, but had become vessels for something older and not necessarily benevolent. The Reverend at the time wrote in a private sermon draft that he believed the transformations to be a form of trial or judgment, but he could not decide whether they were chosen by God or claimed by another master. The Reverend's draft ends mid-sentence, and his handwriting in the final lines is so erratic that it appears almost illegible. The sealed medical report contains a final statement that was later removed from the official copy, but survives in the handwritten notes of an assistant. The statement reads, "Subjects have transcended human biological classification and do not conform to any known anatomical or physiological norms further. Observation is recommended only at extreme distance and with protective measures." This assistant, who copied the statement, later vanished during a trip to Topeka in 1880. Now I must tell you the part I am least certain of, though it is the part most often repeated in whispers decades later. It is said that one winter night, long after the epidemic had passed, a faint light could be seen moving across the Blackwood property, not like lanterns and not like fire, but something steadier and colder. People swore it traveled not on the ground, but above it, as though it slid silently through the air, and that in the weeks afterward, those who had seen it up close began to have vivid dreams of landscapes they did not know, mountains that rose at impossible angles, rivers that bent against gravity, skies where the stars seemed to drift like fish through water. You may think these are only rural superstitions, the sort of stories that grow in the telling, but I will remind you that the absence of proof is not proof of absence, and in the case of the Blackwood brothers, the deliberate destruction of records is a kind of proof in itself, proof that someone believed the truth was too corrosive to remain in the open. And I will leave it to you to decide whether you wish to carry this knowledge any further, for if the old witnesses are to be believed, the brothers' fate was not to die in any way we would understand, but to move on into a condition that no human language is built to describe. And if that is the truth, then perhaps it is not only the past that is in question, but the present, and whether we have truly left them behind at all. Cedar Ridge, Kansas, in the 1870s, was a place that could trick a man into thinking the world was simple, when in truth it was only quiet in the way that a predator's breathing is quiet before it moves. The settlement sat in a shallow fold of land, surrounded by low rolling prairie that seemed to ripple under the wind like the surface of a slow river, and in summer the air hung heavy with the scent of wheat and cottonwood sap, while in winter the horizon narrowed under walls of white, and the snow creaked underfoot like dry wood being split. The population was small, perhaps 300 souls scattered across weather-beaten houses and barns, a people bound by the kind of religion that is less about comfort and more about endurance. The men worked their fields until their hands hardened like oak, and the women kept their homes with a steady precision that wasted nothing, and even the children learned early to keep their voices low. In the presence of elders there were no saloons. Here no theaters, no music, except the slow, deliberate hymns that rolled out of the church each Sunday like the sound of a distant mill wheel turning, and to the outside eye it was a quiet place free of great drama, but to live here was to understand. That quiet was only the surface below, which currents moved that no one wanted to name. At the center of this community stood the single road that cut through town, its dust whipped into small whirls by summer winds, its mud dragging at cartwheels in spring. On either side stood the necessary structures: the mercantile, the smithy, the church, the doctor's office, the single-room schoolhouse every building, showing the weather's toll in peeling paint and warped boards. Yet they endured, because the people endured for in Cedar Ridge survival was a kind of worship. It is important to understand that the land here does not forgive easily the soil, though rich can turn against you with sudden drought, or drown your crops with a month of rainstorms, roll down from the northwest with lightning that burns entire. Pastures to ash and hailstones that leave cattle staggering blind, and more than one man over the years swore he had seen lightning strike the same patch of ground again and again, as though it had been marked for some reason beyond weather. Into this setting came the first rumors of sickness in the summer of 1878, but even before the disease, there were signs that something strange was threading its way through the ordinary life of the town. One account written by a schoolteacher mentions a night in June when the moon rose red and seemed to hang lower than usual. The teacher noted that the air felt thick enough to taste, and that several children complained of ringing in their ears, though there was no sound to cause it livestock. In certain pastures refused to lie down to sleep that night, standing rigid until morning, and in the following weeks a few townsfolk swore they heard voices in the wind, voices speaking in a cadence unlike any prayer or song known to them. The elders of Cedar Ridge dismissed such talk as foolishness, for in a place where work and survival take all of a person's strength, there is no time for speculation. Yet the stories did not stop, and they grew stranger. A seamstress claimed that while walking home after dark, she passed a stand of cottonwoods and saw a pail flicker between the trunks like lantern light, but when she approached, she found no one, there only the smell of iron strong enough to sting the nose, and the wind died around her as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. She did not tell this publicly for fear of being thought unstable, but she confided it in a friend who later wrote it down when the sickness began. It is in this uneasy atmosphere that we must place the arrival of the Blackwood brothers, not simply as farmers or new residents, but as a kind of catalyst for whatever currents already moved beneath Cedar Ridge, for though no one could prove it then, and none can prove it now, there are those who believe the land itself was waiting for them, and that the events which followed were less a matter of chance, and more the unfolding of something long prepared. The wheat fields, stretching to the horizon, the cottonwoods, whispering along the creek, the endless sky pressing down on all of it. These were not merely the backdrop, but part of the thing itself, the stage upon which the shape of the world here would twist into something no longer safe to look at directly. They came in the spring of 1872, when the prairie was waking for winter. The wind, carrying the smell of thawed earth, and the creeks running high with meltwater. Their arrival was not marked by any grand announcement, only the slow rumble of two heavy wagons drawn by black draft horses, the kind bred for endurance rather than speed, and the townsfolk watched from doorways and fields as the four men passed through without a word except to each other, their faces sunburnt from travel there, eyes hard from distance. They did not stop in the center of town, but continued west toward the edge of settlement, where the land rose slightly and the grass grew taller, as if no plow had yet touched it there. They bought 640 acres from a homesteader eager to return east, claiming the place was too lonely for his wife. The brothers were each distinct in manner, yet bound by a sameness that was difficult to name. Ezra, the eldest, was broad-shouldered, his eyes a pale cold blue that seemed to measure a man's worth before deciding if he would speak to him. Caleb, the second-born, carried a notebook in which he wrote constantly, as if tallying accounts only he could understand. Josiah was the scholar with books in his wagon on medicine, scripture, and natural philosophy, and he spoke less often than the others. Yet when he did, it was with the careful precision of someone who weighed each word for its exact shape. Abel, the youngest, had the look of a man who could not hide what he felt, his faith worn openly in the way he clasped his hands when speaking of God, and in the fervor that lit his eyes when he listened to hymns. With their inheritance, They built a stone house larger than any in Cedar Ridge, not ostentatious but solid in the way of things meant to outlast their makers. Beside it, they raised a small chapel of the same stone, with narrow windows and a steeple that pointed sharply at the sky. Like a finger in accusation, they worshipped there each dawn and each night, their prayers audible to no one beyond the walls, though now and then a late rider passing by claimed to hear a low droning sound like voices, joined in a single unbroken note. They kept to themselves not from hostility, but from a kind of deliberate separation. When they came to town, it was for supplies, nothing more. They attended the Methodist church only once, perhaps, to show they were not opposed to community worship. And though they were treated with courtesy, no real warmth passed between them and the other settlers, yet there was no reason to think ill of them. Their fields thrived, their livestock grew fat. They paid in coin rather than credit, and they neither quarreled nor drank. Still there were murmurs, for the prairie has its own sense of balance, and it is said that sometimes it will reject what does not belong. There was an incident, though small at the time, that some later recalled as a sign. During a winter of 1874, a blizzard rolled down from the north, catching several families. Unprepared, one man lost in the white stumbled upon the Blackwood place, and swore afterward that while the wind howled in every direction, the snow did not touch the ground within the fence line. It swirled and broke, as if around some invisible barrier. He was given shelter and food, but he left before dawn, saying only that the air inside the house was too still, and that he could hear a faint, rhythmic sound beneath the floorboards, like breathing. Over the years, the brothers expanded their land, yet never hired outside help, preferring to work alone, though no one could explain how 4 men managed to tend so much acreage without ever appearing overworked or worn. And it was noticed by those who paid attention that no birds nested in the cottonwoods nearest their chapel, even in high summer, when every other stand of trees was alive. With them in the evenings, as the sun bled into the horizon, the brothers would sometimes stand motionless in the fields for an hour or more, their faces turned toward the west, their lips moving without sound. And once a boy, hiding in the grass, swore he saw the shadows of all 4 stretch in the wrong direction, though the sun was still above the horizon. Whatever they were, whatever they carried with them, it seemed to lie dormant in those years, a weight beneath the soil, waiting without hurry for the right moment to break the surface. And when that moment came in the form of sickness, there were those who would remember every small unease, every unexplainable thing, and understand too late that none of it had been without meaning. It began in the heat of July, when the ground cracked underfoot and the air shimmered above the fields. The first to fall was Sarah Hartman, a woman of 32 strong and used to hardship, who collapsed while hanging laundry in the late afternoon. By the time her husband carried her inside, her skin was flushed, deep crimson, her eyes unfocused, and her breath shallow. She spoke no words, only sounds that did not belong to any language. The neighbors had heard before harsh syllables pressed together, like stones grinding in a stream. She died before dawn, her face slack, yet her lips still moving, as though whispering to someone who was not there. Within 3 days, there were 6 more cases, men, women, and children alike. No pattern, except that once the fever took hold, it moved fast and without mercy. The doctor said typhoid, though it came too quickly, spread too strangely, and the bodies at death did not resemble the living. They had been skin taking on a waxen sheen, as if the heat had melted them from the inside, eyes that reopened hours after death, fixed on nothing, yet refusing to close, and in some cases voices that continued faintly in the throat, though the chest no longer rose. The town well was the first suspect, though the water ran clear and cold from the limestone beneath Cedar Ridge. The doctor ordered it sealed and a new one dug, but the sickness ignored this, as the water had nothing to do with it. Some families fell entirely, others lost only 1 or 2, yet in a way that seemed deliberate. The Patterson twins died at the same moment in separate rooms, their mother screaming, as she realized she was hearing the same final gasp twice at once. Fear took hold faster than the fever. The streets emptied, the church pews sat barren on Sunday. Men posted watches at night, not against intruders, but against what might come from within their own homes. It was whispered that some of the sick spoke to unseen visitors, and that more than one had reached out a hand, as if grasping something offered just beyond sight. Children were kept indoors, but one boy, who slipped out to fish at the creek, returned pale and trembling, claiming he had seen Sarah Hartman walking barefoot in the shallows, her head tilted as if listening to the water. The Blackwood place was untouched, no cough, no fever, no pallor, their fields still green, their cattle grazing as though the heat and sickness did not exist. A few said it was simply God rewarding the faithful, for the brothers were known to pray longer and harder than any, but others muttered that it was unnatural, too clean, too safe in a summer when the rest of the land was dying. Dr. Morrison went out himself to speak with them, finding all four in the chapel, their heads bowed, their voices low, though when they looked up at him, he felt an odd vibration in his ears, as if the sound had not stopped, even though their mouths were closed. By the end of the second week, 42 people were dead. The rest were either caring for the sick or locking their doors against the night. Some spoke of leaving before it took them too, but the prairie is wide and hard to cross in high summer, and most stayed hoping the worst had passed. It had not. The sickness was not just a matter of blood and body. There was something else in it, something that moved from person to person, without touch, without breath, something that chose who would live and who would not, and though no one yet said it aloud. More than one person had begun to wonder if the Blackwoods were the ones doing the choosing. On the 10th of August, when the air was so thick with heat, it seemed to press the breath back into the lungs, Josiah Blackwood walked into the heart of Cedar Ridge, without hat or coat, his shirt clinging to him not from sweat, but from some faint dampness that smelled faintly of iron. He stopped in front of the doctor's house and asked to see Timothy Fletcher. The boy was fevered beyond saving, his mother weeping at his side, the doctor already preparing himself to write another name in the ledger, but Josiah only said he had been given a revelation in prayer, that he and his brothers could take the sickness upon themselves and spare the boy. The mother was too desperate to refuse. She let Josiah lay a hand on the boy's forehead, and for a moment the whole room seemed to lose its air, as if the walls had drawn inward. Timothy's eyes rolled back, his skin cooled in minutes, and the flush drained away, leaving him asleep and breathing steady. Josiah, however, staggered back, pale, with a strange glaze over his eyes, his own skin now burning hot to the touch, with the telltale crimson patches spreading along his arms. Dr. Morrison insisted it was madness, but within hours Josiah was at the home of another family, and another each time. The sick rose from bed, their strength returning, and Josiah's own body showing more signs of the fever. By the next day, Ezra, Caleb, and Abel had joined him. They moved from house to house, sometimes together, sometimes alone, and though their faces remained calm, their voices had taken on a strange tone, slow and resonant, as if something behind the words was speaking too. Some said they heard two voices at once from their mouths, one in English, the other in something older, stranger. One woman swore she heard her dead father's voice among them, though she had not seen him since she was a child. By the 13th, all four brothers bore the marks of the fever, yet none seemed close to death. In Ezra, the skin grew pale and almost translucent, so that faint blue veins could be seen running like rivers beneath. In Caleb, the red spots of the fever arranged themselves in perfect geometric patterns, shifting slowly as if alive. Josiah's skin darkened to the color of old parchment, and thin lines of writing moved across it, in languages no one could read, and Abel, the youngest, was seen at night standing in the field with no lantern and no moonlight, yet glowing faintly as though a small star had fallen into his chest. The town whispered that the brothers had made some covenant, that their prayers had opened a door not meant to be opened, and that the sickness itself had recognized them somehow, for even as they took on its signs, the fever no longer seemed to weaken them. Instead, it shaped them, changing them into something else. Their eyes caught the lamplight. Strangely, their shadows fell in the wrong direction, and once a child who had been cured swore he saw Abel's reflection moving a half-second out of time with his body. By the end of that week, the Blackwoods had entered more homes than any doctor, preacher, or neighbor in the county. Yet none who received their touch died from the fever. Still there was an unease growing, a sense that something had been set in motion that could not be undone, because the brothers were not simply curing the sick. They were taking something from them, something unseen that left those cured with eyes just a little more distant and dreams they could not speak aloud. Dr. Morrison arrived at the Blackwood farm in the early light of August 17th, the sun not yet clearing the eastern hills, and a mist hanging low over the wheat that should have been yellow and brittle from drought. Yet here stood tall green, and heavy with grain. The air was damp with a smell like rain. Though the sky had been clear for weeks, the cattle moved slowly at the fence, their eyes following him too steadily for his liking as he dismounted and walked toward the stone house. The brothers emerged together from the chapel, their movements oddly in rhythm, their steps landing in a cadence that seemed almost deliberate. Ezra spoke first, his voice deeper than Morrison remembered, each word carrying a vibration that he could feel in his teeth. His skin was so pale it almost seemed lit from within, and when the doctor pressed a finger to his wrist, the pulse was strong. But faster than any man should sustain his blood, when drawn gleamed faintly gold in the syringe, as if some fine dust floated within. Caleb allowed Morrison to examine his arms, the rose-colored patches on his skin arranged in shifting patterns. Morrison stared as the shapes turned from circles to lines to spirals, and then to a series of intricate symbols that rearranged themselves when he blinked. Josiah sat without protest, his shirt unbuttoned to the waist, his skin dry and papery, covered in thin black script that seemed to sink and rise under the flesh as though it were ink on water. Morrison leaned closer, but the letters were not any. He knew they seemed to twist slightly when he tried to focus, and a faint whisper rose in his ears, though no one in the room had spoken. Abel stood apart, watching with eyes that reflected the dim light like a cat's when Morrison approached him. He realized the boy was warm, almost hot to the touch, yet showed no sweat when asked if he had eaten. Abel only smiled faintly and said he no longer required bread or water. Morrison wrote in his notes that their respiration was steady, but unnaturally deep, as if each breath was drawn from a place far beyond the lungs. Their heartbeats were not synchronized with their breathing. Their pupils shifted size independently of the light, and their shadows where they fell on the floor did not always match their posture. When Morrison asked about pain, they answered together, "We are beyond that now, doctor," and the harmony of their voices made his hand shake so badly he blotted the ink. He left the house unsettled, yet compelled to return, because the brothers spoke as if they knew things he could not know about the fever, about the land, even about him. He did not write down everything they told him, for fear it would mark him as mad, but one phrase he could not forget. They said, "The sickness is not a sickness. It is a messenger, and we are listening." And as he rode back to town, he saw in the fields behind him the four of them, standing perfectly still, their faces turned toward the sunless horizon, as if watching something no one else could see. Word spread through Cedar Ridge faster than the fever ever had, some calling it a miracle, others whispering that it was an abomination. The townsfolk could not agree on what the Blackwood brothers had become. Some claimed they had been chosen by God to bear the sickness and spare the rest. Others said the disease had hollowed them out and left something else in their place. Farmers from miles away began arriving at the edge of their land, hoping to see the men for themselves. Some came with offerings of bread or livestock to thank them for ending the fever. Others refused to step any closer than the fence line, as if some invisible boundary lay between the farm and the rest of the world. Those who visited told stories of strange sights, the brothers standing motionless in the fields for hours without, speaking or blinking of faint humming that rose from the chapel at night, a sound that seemed too low to hear, but still made the hair rise on the back of the neck. A woman named Mrs. Patterson swore she felt a pressure in her mind when she tried to enter the chapel, as if an unseen hand pressed gently but firmly against her thoughts until she stepped away. Others described dreams after visiting the farm, dreams of walking through wheat taller than a man, dreams of a black river that reflected not the sky, but faces they did not recognize. On Sunday, the brothers came into town for the first time since the outbreak. They did not speak to anyone, yet their presence bent the air around them. Conversations faltered. When they passed, people stepped aside, without knowing why. Their eyes seemed to shine even in shadow. And when Ezra looked directly at a man named Henry Clovis, the man swore he heard his mother's voice whisper his name, though she had been dead 20 years. The Methodist preacher tried to welcome them, but his words trailed off as Josiah's gaze settled on him, and for a moment his mouth moved soundlessly before he stepped back, pale and trembling. At night, lights began to appear over the Blackwood farm, soft glows that drifted above the fields like lanterns with no flame. Some swore they heard voices in those lights, speaking in languages no one knew. Dr. Morrison visited again, but when he returned, he refused to speak of what he had seen. He only said they were not the same men they had been, and would not be again. The line between holy and unholy blurred for the people of Cedar Ridge, and each day fewer dared to cross it. By September, the fever was gone as sudden as it had come. No more deaths, no more sickness, and yet the town did not return to normal, because the Blackwood brothers were still there, and whatever they had become was still unfolding. Their land now looked different to the eye, the wheat taller, the leaves of the cottonwoods darker, the soil itself black and rich, as if it had drunk deep from something far below the surface and been changed for it. Dr. Morrison's visits became more frequent, yet more secretive. He no longer carried his medical bag openly and stopped writing in his usual ledger. Instead, using small slips of paper he burned after each visit, he told no one what he found, but a few words escaped overheard when he thought himself alone. Blood temperature, impossible tissue density, unmeasurable cognitive function, altered beyond classification. And once, just once, the words, "This is not evolution, this is intrusion." Ezra's skin grew more translucent, veins visible like golden threads pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm. His voice, when he spoke, seemed to come from the walls as much as his mouth. Caleb's shifting spots had become moving diagrams that rearranged into shapes no one recognized, shapes that made the eyes water if looked at for too long. Josiah's parchment skin now bore text in countless languages, some human, some not, each line crawling faintly as though alive, and Abel glowed faintly even in daylight, his star-filled eyes fixed on horizons no one else could see. The brothers no longer ate nor drank, yet seemed stronger than before. They could be seen walking the fields at night, speaking without words, sometimes standing in a perfect square, as if marking the corners of something that only they knew about. Neighbors began to whisper that there was a hum beneath the earth on still nights, a vibration you could feel in your teeth if you stood near the chapel. The Methodist preacher stopped holding services entirely after waking one morning to find every page of his Bible blank, except for a single line in black script, "Go no further." One evening, a group of young men dared each other to approach the chapel. They crossed the fence and made it halfway to the door before all three collapsed to their knees, vomiting and bleeding from the nose. They claimed afterward they had seen the inside of the chapel, without entering it, seeing the pews stretching away into a distance that could not fit. Inside such a building, seen a sky where the ceiling should be, and something moving in it, watching them above. By the first frost, the brothers were no longer seen in town at all. Their land was avoided. Completely, wagons would detour miles out of the way, rather than pass it in the years that followed the stone. Chapel sank slowly into the earth as though being swallowed until only the roof showed, then nothing at all. The Kansas State Medical Board sealed all records. The Methodist Church erased every mention of the family from its archives, and those few who remembered learned not to speak of it. But the fields remain strange. Even now travelers say the wheat there moves, though there is no wind, and at night, if you stand too close, you can feel that same hum deep in your teeth, and if you linger too long, some say, you will begin to dream of the Blackwood brothers, and in those dreams, they will turn to face you, and you will understand that they have not gone anywhere at all.